So this morning's scripture from the Gospel of Mark is the account of the Transfiguration, because this is Transfiguration Day, this mysterious event where Jesus is resplendent and the disciples are bedazzled. So I read now from the 9th chapter of Mark, beginning with verse 2. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He didn't know what to say because they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. So, as they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had been raised from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Last Sunday, I was the guest preacher at First United Methodist Church in Tupelo, Mississippi. Does anyone know what Tupelo, Mississippi is famous for? The birthplace of Elvis Presley. All right. So that's part of the reason I accepted the invitation to Tupelo, but I didn't tell them that. So that morning I preached twice, and then I had a free afternoon, and then I did some teaching Sunday night and then on Monday. So since I had this long free afternoon last Sunday, I dropped a big hint in my sermon that morning about what an Elvis fan I am. And sure enough, a very kind couple, a doctor and his wife from town, came up after the service, and they volunteered to take me on an Elvis tour. Success. So we went to the little 2-room shotgun house where he was born, and then close to it, and you can imagine it up here on the screens, all right? I'll point to the screens every time you can imagine, right? So there it is. So then what they've done is they've moved this 1-room Assemblies of God church where Elvis and his father Vernon and mother Gladys worshiped until Elvis was 13, and they moved from Tupelo to Memphis. So it was a 1-room Assemblies of God church, and what happens is that you go in and you sit down, and there's a docent that comes in. She says a few words, and then she lowers the house lights, and up in front of you and on either side of you, the whole place, these screens roll down with this lovely hum, and you are surrounded on 3 sides by a reenactment of a worship service in the early to mid-40s in rural Mississippi, Pentecostal worship service. There's a troupe of actors from Memphis that do a great job of this, and you sit in this darkened sanctuary, and there is Brother Frank Smith, who first taught Elvis to play a D, C, and an E chord. There's Vernon and Gladys as Brother Frank invites them up with little Elvis to sing his first public presentation of Jesus Loves Me, This I Know. And there all the congregation, and I have to say, friends, I was just so transported by this that I forgot that I was a tourist in 2015 in a reenactment, and when Brother Frank invited us all to stand up and sing Love Lifted Me, I stood up, and I started to sing, and the other people are looking at me like, what? But I didn't care. I didn't care, because I'd been totally transported into the past, into this scene. Now, I was talking later at the dinner with Jane Riley. Jane Riley is 79 years old. I know that because she's a year younger than Elvis, and he would be 80 this year. She was a year behind him in school, and I said, "Jane," I said, "you knew Elvis. What stories have you got to tell about that?" She said, "Well, he was just a boy in a year ahead of us. And sometimes I would look out in the play yard, and he'd be sitting out there under a tree strumming his guitar. But, he was from the wrong side of the Tupelo tracks. And so he was not a boy that I would have ever invited to one of my birthday parties. I thought, what if little Jane at 10 years old had been standing out in the play yard, and suddenly 3 screens had rolled down, and she had been treated to a vision of the star on the stage that boy would become. I bet she would have invited him to one of her birthday parties then. But as Jane said, I wish that I had known then what I know now. And that, my friends, is hindsight, right? What is the old saying? Hindsight is 20/20. I wish I had known then what I know now. But we never ever say foresight is 20/20. Foresight is 20/20. I have always wanted to preach a sermon with that title, and this is my opportunity. Foresight is 20/20. Peter, James, and John could start saying it after this vision that they had of Jesus on this mountain. Look at the screens, and you see there, look at your imagination screen, and we see that what God does here on Transfiguration Day is roll down the screens of your mind's eye and shows us, there are Moses and Elijah. And they're talking with Jesus about his resurrection glory. Moses was known for his humility, and Elijah was known for his boldness. What a great combination for Jesus. And both were prophets who had known suffering and had found God to be faithful. And there they are talking with him. In the Jewish understanding of that day, the appearance of these two would be a sign that this is the Messiah, because Elijah was to show up first to point the way. And Moses, the Messiah was to be a new Moses, the giver of a new law. So when these two show up, we get the message. And then there is Jesus, and he is dazzling with a white, light-covered garment. In the Bible, dazzling white clothing is a sign of divinity. And in Psalm 104:2, it says, "You are full of might and majesty. God, you are clothed with light like a garment." And so there is Jesus with these two prophets talking with him. And then there's Peter. And Peter, let's just be honest, Peter was a blurter, wasn't he? Peter was a blurter. He liked to blurt out whatever he was thinking before engaging his rational mind. Bad habit, but who knows what he was thinking when he starts babbling about these booths. Maybe he was talking about a reference to the Feast of Tabernacles, where the Jews built booths to honor God, sheltering them in the wilderness. Or maybe he was just looking at these 3 figures and he's thinking, wow, these guys are really important. They shouldn't be standing out in the open. Whatever, it's a moot point, because they aren't hanging around long enough for anybody to build them a booth. They disappear. A cloud comes over the whole scene. A voice comes out of the cloud that reminds us of Moses, what he heard when he was on Mount Sinai, and God was over that with the cloud, and God said to the Israelites, "This is my prophet. From now on, trust him." The voice says, "This is my beloved son. Trust him." And then the cloud fades, and the 3 disciples are left alone with only Jesus for company to go down the mountain. But they have this opportunity to meet every adversity that comes down the path toward them as they walk with him to the cross through the lens of this 20/20 resurrection foresight. They have the opportunity to have that lens. But will they put on the glasses? Do you know anybody who needs a dose of 20/20 resurrection foresight? Anybody? A dose of victory in the midst of defeat? A couple years ago, I was invited to Highland Park United Methodist Church to speak on the parables to a class, and they have these grade-aided classes, so this one was for people 80 years old and older. If you're 79, forget it, you can't get into this class. So I showed up at room 120, 15 minutes early, And I went in, and the woman who was greeting me, her name happened to be Alyce, so we were talking about that. And then another woman came in, and her name was Alyce, so we're having like a little Alyce convention here. And then I looked around the room, and it was mainly women. And then another woman came in, and she was standing off to the side, looking kind of pensively around the room. And I said, come on over, we're just chatting. And she came over, and we allowed her to join us, even though her name was Evelyn. And I said, this class has really been meeting for quite a while, hasn't it? She said, yes. She said, yes, it has. We began in the 1950s as a couples class, and we're called the 2x2 class. But, you know, now probably we should rename ourselves the 1x1 class. She said, now all of us are old, and a lot of us are dead. And then, as if realizing how that sounded, she smiled brightly and she said, and we are so glad to have you join us today. All of us are old, and a lot of us are dead. Do you know anybody who has a need for a dose of Resurrection 2020 foresight? As I was coming home from Tupelo last Monday night, I was waiting at gate C10A in the Memphis airport. And I was sitting there with my overstuffed, roll-on, and looking up at Wolf Blitzer, who was on every screen around the waiting area. And he's there with his situation room, interviewing various experts. And he was showing the fresh face of the 26-year-old aid worker, Kayla Muller. And they were showing pictures of the supposedly bombed-out building that the Jordanians had supposedly bombed, and she was supposedly dead, and he was talking with people about whether that was true. And I looked around, and usually people sit when they're waiting, but I noticed that a lot of people had stood up and were standing, watching Wolf, and just going like this. You know, like the opposite of bobblehead? And I thought, you know what? There are a lot of different ways to respond to the feeling of helplessness that we have. I mean, this one is, yeah, we can read the future, and the future is more of being at the mercy of this. That's one way, pessimism. Another posture is the head and the hands, which is anguish, which is empathy for those who suffer from the acts of violence and prejudice in our world. So there's this, pessimism, there's this, anguish, and then there's this, which is fear, that we're going to be next. So you've got this, and you've got this, and you've got this. And these were the three responses to their situation room that the church that Mark was writing to was going through. They were at the mercy of probably the cruelest of the Roman emperors, and they set a high bar for cruelty. Emperor Nero. Nero was conducting persecutions of Mark's church, and Mark wants to say to them, 2020 foresight, resurrection foresight. It's as if Mark wants to roll down the screens on all sides of his church and to show them the transfiguration, to show them how to be disciples in tough times. Now, you probably heard the old joke. I wish I'd made this up, but I didn't. But it's an old joke, and it says that the disciples in Mark's gospel should really be called the disciples, right? Because they never get it. In Matthew's gospel, they get it, sort of, eventually. In Mark's gospel, they never get it. 3 times in chapters 8 through 10, Jesus foretells his death and his resurrection. But the disciples stop listening when they hear the word death. And so they come down from the mountain to take things at face value, to trust appearances. If it looks like loss, then it's loss. If it looks like failure, then it's failure. If it looks like death, then it's death. The disciples. Trust appearances, not the promise of God. Not the promise of God to bring life from death. But the disciples, this is Mark's hope for his church and for us. The disciples will walk down from the mountain with those 2020 resurrection lenses on their eyes, And they will look and they will say, you know, we look small, but we're not unimportant. You know, we see disappointment, but we discern beneath it the actions of God bringing life from death. You know, we see death, but we believe in life. The disciples trust appearance is not God. The disciples trust the power of God, the promises of God to bring life from death. Now, I did not grow up in rural Mississippi. My parents were from the South, but they moved and became Yankees in the early 50s in Pennsylvania. So I grew up in a church in a little town on the Susquehanna River in central Pennsylvania. And we attended a Methodist church before they were United Methodists. And it was much smaller than this sanctuary. It was a very dark, oak-paneled. And I remember I was just fascinated as a little girl, maybe 4, and I would sit there and I would look when it came time for the sermon. They had this habit of lowering the house lights, and the preacher in this elevated pulpit, they had a spot in the ceiling. The house lights would go down. Anybody remember this? And the preacher would get all lit up. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. I don't want to say that that's my only motivation going into the ministry. That would be shallow, right? But I thought that was really cool. But then, but leading up to the sermon, what I would do is I would stand in the pew. I was a lot shorter then. And I would look behind me. You know how kids at restaurants, you ever in a restaurant and the little child is in the booth behind you and they stand up and they look at you and they just find your face really interesting. So they just stare at you a lot longer than would be socially appropriate for an adult, right? So what I would do is I would stand in the pew and I would look at the back window and I would look at the 2 men back there in the back. Because on one of the windows, these side-by-side windows, one of them, there was this man. And he was kneeling, and he had his hands clasped, and the background was shadowy, and he was kneeling and leaning against a rock, and he had this look of anguish on his face. And when the sun would shine on a sunny Sunday, I could see this tear glimmering red like a ruby on his face. And I would feel so sorry for him. And then I would look over to the other side. Next to him was another man. And this man had like a bright background, and he was kind of in this kind of posture. And I wondered to myself, why isn't he wearing sneakers? And then I realized that he didn't need them because his feet were this high off the ground. And he had a kind of happy, joyful look on his face. And so I would stand and I would look from one to the other. My mother every week would tug on my little ruffled dress, and she would say, "Alice, sit down. The sermon's about to start. Turn around. Sit down." Finally, after several weeks of this struggle, she said, "What are you staring at? What are you doing?" I said, "I'm wondering why that happy man can't help that sad man." She said, "Oh." And then, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, she said, "Oh, well, they're the same man. I'll explain later." Yeah, still working on that one. So I tell her she was my first professor of theology. The bridge between the Garden of Gethsemane and the resurrection, the ascension, the power, is the power of God to bring life out of death. It is the power of God to bring wisdom from your most crushing disappointment. It's the power of God to bring honor from humiliation. It's the power of God to bring community from acts of violence. And it is the power of God to bring life and new direction from a dead end. It's the power in your life of God to do everything for you in your life that God did for Jesus. It is the words of Isaiah 55. "My word that goes forth from my mouth shall accomplish that for which I sent it. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall achieve that for which I sent it." The fact that the world doesn't believe this doesn't make it not true. The fact that I believe it doesn't make it true. The fact that it's true makes it true in the promises that we have from God. Do you know anybody who needs the foresight of Resurrection 2020? Resurrection 2020 is different from hindsight 2020. Hindsight 2020 says, oh, if only I'd known then what I know now. But Resurrection Foresight 2020 says, since I know now, what I know now, I proceed into the future with confidence. Do you know anybody? Do you know anybody who lives by Resurrection 2020? There was a young, bold prophet who lived by Resurrection 2020. And on Friday night, January 27th, 1956, he experienced Resurrection 2020. He came home after extended meetings about the Montgomery boycott, going on longer than he had anticipated. And in his book, Stride Toward Freedom, he tells how it went. He said, I was ready to give up. With my cup of coffee sitting untouched before me, I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing to be a coward. And in this state of exhaustion, when my courage had all but gone, I decided to take my problem to God. With my head in my hands, I bowed over the kitchen table and I prayed out loud. The words I spoke to God that midnight are still vivid in my memory. I'm here, taking a stand for what I believe is right. But now I am afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I have come to the point where I cannot face it alone. At that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced God before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever. Almost at once, my fears began to go, my uncertainty disappeared, and I was ready for anything. Do you know anybody who lives by 2020 foresight? Someday I hope my Bible is as worn as this one. This Bible belonged to my husband's great-aunt Catherine. Aunt Catherine passed away a couple years ago in her early 90s. She was a woman who went on a donkey into Mexico in the early 1940s to be a missionary. She had a background as a linguist. And so she went, before there were paved roads or paths, and she went to create a language for a group of Mayan descendants, the Chantal, in Ishmaquilpan. They had no written language. And she spent her life creating this language for them. And this is her Bible. And in the flyleaf of her Bible, she has written her motto for getting through it all. She was a woman who was faithful, and fearless, not the other way around. Faithful and fearless. She wasn't afraid of monsoons. She wasn't afraid of communist opposition. She wasn't afraid of hunger. She proceeded. And she was not afraid of leukemia. When she called me a couple years ago, she said, Alice, they tell me there's something wrong with my blood, something about the platelets. They say I need transfusions, and I need more blood. And so they gave her more blood for a while until the transfusions had to be more frequent, and they didn't work. And then my husband, who is her great-nephew, went out to help take care of her affairs and to be a comfort for her. The doctor asked if Murray, my husband, would go in and break the news to her. And so he went in, and he sat on the side of her hospital bed, and he said, Catherine, they're going to need to have hospice come in. Do you know what that means? She said, yes, it means that I get to meet Jesus. He said, that's right. And what are you going to say to him? And without skipping a beat, she said, I'm going to tell him how much I love him. I'm going to tell him how much I love him. Do you know anybody? Do you know anybody who lives with 2020 foresight? The motto that she wrote in her Bible is this: When troubles mount and worries grow large, remind me, Lord, of who's in charge. That is what'll get us down the mountain to walk toward the cross all the way with Jesus. And oh yes, toward the resurrection. Thanks be to God for 2020 resurrection foresight. Amen.